This video is brought to you by NordVPN. In the long and illustrious history of Christmas, few stories stand out as much as the iconic Charles Dickens story, A Christmas Carol. This festive parable tells the tale of the cold and stingy Ebenezer Scrooge, a selfish old man who despises Christmas. Over the course of Christmas Eve, Scrooge is visited by three ghosts representing past, present and future, each showing him the error of his ways and changing him for the better. After its initial release in 1843, A Christmas Carol would become a staple of the holiday, adapted in different ways in every possible medium. From Blackadder to Muppets, this novella has inspired many, including one Stephen Moffat.
Dickens at Christmas. A Christmas Carol is probably my favourite Christmas story of all time.
So, when Moffat became showrunner of Doctor Who, it made sense he'd want to use the annual Christmas special slot to craft his own version of the story. This led to the aptly titled A Christmas Carol, seeing the Doctor travel along the timeline of Kazran Sardik, a jaded and bitter old man whose cloud manipulation device is the only way to save Amy and Rory, who are trapped on board a crashing spaceship. Out of all the Doctor Who Christmas specials, it's safe to say this is one of the most popular and acclaimed, especially because of its nomination for a Hugo Award for short form dramatic presentation. But as someone with no nostalgic affinity for the Matt Smith era, does this festive fairy tale still hold up? Or is it actually massively overhyped like the series it served as an epilogue for? Well, I guess that's what I'm here to find out. So get yourself cozy with some chocolate or other Christmas snacks, because it's time to review A Christmas Carol.
And you know what boys say in the face of danger?
What?
Mummy.
A Christmas Carol is... Wait, what's that out of the window? Ooh, it's me, the ghost of NordVPN past. NordVPN? You mean the most secure and powerful VPN in the world with over 5,400 servers across 59 countries? Yes, it's me, and I have a grave warning for you. All this time you have been browsing the internet unprotected, with your online information easy for anyone to steal. That coffee shop Wi-Fi? Everyone could see what you were doing. Oh no, how can I protect myself? Hey, what's up? It's me, the ghost of NordVPN Future. Future? Isn't the present supposed to come next? It works for the ad read. Anyway, you need to change your ways by using NordVPN. Not only will it allow you to stay safe online and bypass internet censorship by unblocking websites, you can even access region-locked content on streaming services. Wow, but how can I get such an incredible, life-changing service? Hello, it's me, the ghost of NordVPN Present, here to tell you that you can get NordVPN's holiday season deal right now by going to www.nordvpn.com/Harbo and using the code HARBO for a huge discount on a 2-year plan with 1 additional month completely free. You'll be protected by a 30-day money-back guarantee, so remember, that's the code HARBO for a big discount and an extra month free. Don't hesitate to protect yourself online. Get NordVPN today. Wow, thanks NordVPN, you've changed my whole life. And now, back to the video. Part 1. Change in Traditions. A Christmas Carol is quite unconventional compared to the Christmas specials that came before it. It was only the second one to feature the current companion, but unlike the Christmas Invasion, it actually positions itself as a companion light story in a similar vein to The Lodger. By trapping Amy and Rory in a crashing spaceship, it opens up the story to allow the Doctor to have his own adventure with different character dynamics, all anchored by the motivation to save his actual companions. I feel like it strikes a good balance, since the stakes are maintained throughout by keeping 2 of the 3 most important characters in constant danger but in the background. However, the opening scene establishing this side of the story is almost laughably over-directed. It's clearly inspired by the J.J. Abrams Star Trek movie that came out in 2009, overusing Dutch angles and heavy lens flare for no real reason other than some strange sense of slickness and style. I would admit this lends an immediate big budget feeling to the special, but it really sticks out compared to the rest of the directing, so it's a bit jarring. I suppose you could see it as a representation of how wildly different the 2 settings are, because they're almost 2 entirely separate worlds, but this direction still feels weird and out of place to me. On board this very 2010 spaceship, Amy and Rory are on their honeymoon engaging in some costumed pillow fort building, so they're conveniently on scene to call in the Doctor to help them, as usual. I like how confident it makes the pair. You can clearly see how far they've come as people since their introductions, and it shows their character growth. Although the line to segue into the intro is comically cringe and nonsensical.
What does that mean? It's Christmas.
Okay, so you're telling me crashing spaceship plus TARDIS plus come along pond equals Christmas? Is it just me that feels like there's a step missing here? To be honest, it's probably somewhere down the back of the sofa alongside my love life, my channel views, and the missing step in human evolution. Another thing A Christmas Carol does to set itself apart from previous specials is the setting. With the exception of the Hollywood party, there isn't a single scene set on Earth. This is a stark contrast to the first Davis era, which grounded itself on our own planet to maintain a sense of relatability for the audience. Instead, Moffat's approach is much more fantastical and science fiction based, preferring to visit other planets for a refreshing change of scenery. However, this intent doesn't stop Sardic Town on the planet Ember from looking exactly like Victorian England, with all these futuristic interstellar settlers dressing in rags. Handy that. Even so, it establishes a clear festive atmosphere because of how ingrained Victorian Christmas is in the UK's culture. A Christmas Carol is so steeped in Victorian iconography because of when it was released, so you may as well play on the audience's familiarity with the source material to help get them immersed. It creates some beautiful visuals, although I'd much prefer a more steampunk aesthetic to truly communicate that this is a completely different planet in the far future. I mean, look at these guys, what's their story? Give me more of that. Part 2, A Christmas Classic. Like I said at the beginning, A Christmas Carol is one of those lasting tales adapted over and over again, even forming the original concept behind Trial of a Time Lord, although that serial ultimately drifted very far from those roots. One of the most important parts of any Christmas Carol adaptation is writing and casting Scrooge himself. He needs to be a stone cold and bitter miser at the beginning, someone thoroughly unlikable. That's the easy part. However, he also needs to end up believably joyous and lovable by the end of the story. Doctor Who's version is able to do this perfectly, casting British icon Michael Gambon as Kazran Sardic, the Scrooge equivalent of the episode. Gambon was fresh off his role as Dumbledore, so everyone was used to him being a wholesome and whimsical old wizard full of wisdom and warmth. However, Gambon's acting experience allows him to immediately establish Kazran as suitably vile.
You know what I call it? I call it expecting something for nothing.
He's so unlikable, he's like some kind of cartoon villain, even doing his best impression of Arnie as Mr. Freeze.
I think she's a bit cool about the whole thing.
What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age!
Kazran is an intensely powerful and wealthy man who can influence even the president since he controls the skies. Right from the get-go, you're given everything you need to know about him. He hates Christmas and those who celebrate it. He has a disdain for poor people, and his daddy issues are established through him instinctively trying to smack around a child. It's a clever opening 10 minutes, cutting right to the chase and making absolutely sure you hate Kazran, especially because he's happy to let the 4,000 people on the ship die. It's because of this strongly negative first impression that his character arc feels perfectly executed. You're introduced to him at such an extreme end of his bitterness that you can see the layers of ice melt away over the course of the narrative as we watch him grow up and fall in love, even if there is a massive speed bump in the middle. He ends up a completely different person at the end, and you can clearly see that because of how he began. By the end, you've seen so many twists and turns you can understand the character on a human level, seeing everything that led to him becoming the way he was in this opening. It's a stellar example of how to write Scrooge, with Gambon, Lawrence Belcher and Danny Horn all performing exceptionally within their stages of the character's life.
It's not going to crash on my house, and what's it got to do with me?
A Christmas Carol is also defined by the ghosts representing the Christmases of the past, present and the future. I mean, who could ever forget the downright terror of the ghost of Christmas yet to come in the Muppets Christmas Carol? That's iconic for a reason, because it gave every kid nightmares. However, because this is Doctor Who, there don't need to be ephemeral ghosts, because we have the time-travelling Doctor. To say Matt Smith hits the ground running this episode would be a huge understatement. He's a whirlwind of chaos, but immediately hardens once he realises the pure apathy he's up against in Sardic. He's so unbelievably Doctorish, perfectly blending whimsy with a threatening aura because if push comes to shove, he'll stop Sardic with force. I love the moment of the Doctor working out why Kazran is the way he is. It's the same kind of thing we saw in the 11th hour, and whilst I'm still not a fan of the Sherlock-y presentation, I like what it achieves. Through the Doctor's clever deductions, we understand Kazran's abusive childhood led to his hatred of Christmas because it reminds him of his father. It's quick and slick exposition because someone else is explaining it, which in turn makes it feel less like exposition. I also really appreciate that the original Christmas Carol is acknowledged in the story. Rather than trying to play it up as a complete sci-fi adaptation, it uses the existence of the Dickens story as the Doctor's solution for convincing Kazran to turn off the weather machine. He's unintentionally reminded of the tale by an actual carol, so he takes the conscious decision to assume the mission of the ghost himself. I just personally find it a clever way to respect the original story and integrate it nicely into this one.
The Doctor must be consciously aware that he's sort of recreating the plot of that story, because Dickens is a character in his universe.
Part 3. The Ghost of Christmas Past.
Who are you?
Tonight, I'm a ghost of Christmas past.
Despite being inspired by Christmas Carol, the only ghost the Doctor acts as is that of the past. I feel like the 11th Doctor specifically is the perfect character to serve this role, because he has always been very child friendly, and this shows in his interactions with the 12-year-old Kazran. I mean, he himself is just a big kid, so he's able to connect with Kazran on a personal level. This allows the child to open up about his sadness that he wasn't in school the day a bunch of skyfish broke through for everyone to see, because, you know, the most interesting stuff always happens when you're off sick.
I'll walk into English class, they put on Shrek, f***ing sick.
I'm kinda mixed on the whole fish stuff. It makes sense for Doctor Who because it's this bizarre piece of sci-fi, but it's kind of out of place to have these magical flying sharks.
There's always a bigger fish.
It's there for goofiness and the action set pieces of a special, but it feels needlessly gimmicky. These fish do serve as an illustration for young Kazran's optimism and youth though. You get to see how sensitive he is because of them, crying over the dying shark. It furthers the characterization of young Kazran and old Kazran being entirely different people. And to put it bluntly, Kazran's childhood is a sad one. He grew up a starry-eyed dreamer full of wonder, but this was beaten out of him by his father. It's a tragic backstory that will sadly always be relatable for a number of viewers. It helps to create sympathy for Kazran because this young child is a completely different person to the grumpy man we know in the present. I also appreciate the way the narrative portrays the past, having it a recording that current Kazran has to watch. It's a genius way for events to play out rather than the typical taking Kazran back in person to see his past. I like the general time shenanigans it allows. It is paradoxical as all hell, but the episode ultimately accounts for all that, and it also makes it make crystal clear sense because the events change the memories of present day Kazran, in turn softening his personality. I think it can all be summed up in this single line.
That never happened. But it did.
To save the air shark after it deep throats the sonic screwdriver, the Doctor and Kazran visit the cold storage chamber, where hundreds of people are kept as security for loans given by the Sardic family. I can't help but feel as though this is a concept let down by the light-hearted nature of Christmas specials. It's an idea ripe for scathing commentaries about politics and finances.
Praise the company.
But the episode just kind of glosses over it, only really using it to say, yeah, Sardic Sr. is a nasty man. It feels like a big bit of missed potential in my eyes, because it could form the basis for an entire episode of its own. And something else the script doesn't seem to acknowledge is that this episode is secretly a psychological horror story about a man keeping a woman frozen in time, only letting her out for one day a year, but always with him, therefore ensuring she would develop feelings for him. He keeps her hidden away from everyone else and takes her out into a world that has become alien to her as all the people she knew in life grow old. It's pretty horrifying when you see it this way. Without intending to, the episode turns Abigail into some kind of plaything, a toy for Kazran to bring out whenever he wants, without her really having much say in the matter. So ultimately, she develops a sort of Stockholm Syndrome. It's just one of those narratives that accidentally becomes extremely dark if you look at it from a slightly different angle. Honestly, you could probably make a trailer of this that frames it as a horror movie and it would be believable. This whole concept felt different with Tommy and Torchwood because that was spread out over a longer period of time, and Torchwood weren't really choosing to throw him out once a year. They had to because of his involvement with the rift problems in the future. And alongside that, his relationship with Tosh happened more naturally compared to this, which feels very sudden and a bit fishy. No pun intended. Abigail Pettigrew herself ended up as kind of a perfect storm behind the scenes. Originally, the production team merely wanted opera singer Katherine Jenkins to provide the singing voice of the character, but they ultimately decided to give her the entire role, and I can't imagine anyone else portraying Abigail. Not only does she have that operatic voice, but she also has that kind of willowy beauty that justifies Kazran's lasting fixation with her. Abigail as a character is the perfect contrast to the older Kazran. She's sensitive and kind, with a very hopeful and optimistic worldview. It makes sense then that she serves as the main catalyst for his change in the present day, because she gives him a reason to care, rather than him being influenced by his father's treatment of him. Indeed, the Doctor takes his new temporary companions out for adventures every Christmas Eve. It's a fun sequence full of magic, from a sleigh ride through the city to a Hollywood party where the Doctor gets engaged to Marilyn Monroe. It's enjoyable, as long as you overlook the fact that for Abigail, every single day is Christmas Eve, so she'd probably get pretty sick of hearing this every time she wakes up.
Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas!
Even still, it's a cute montage, seeing modern Kazran unlocking all these new memories and reminiscing on these adventures and photos. It helps to show you just how extensively the Doctor's time meddling is changing the future and influencing Kazran as a person. Having all the photos from Without Time and Space also justifies the romance between Kazran and Abigail, because it's clear they spent a lot of time together, more than just like 16 hours at a time. Although the logic of body clocks and time zones does get a bit murky, so we'll just overlook that. You can clearly see how Abigail's unwavering belief in Kazran's potential ultimately helps him turn things around and save the day. So she's a good part of the narrative, even if she does feel like a bit of a plot device at times, especially the ending. All these fun little adventures through time and space are underlined by a bittersweet feeling as the number on Abigail's status chamber counts down each time. Earlier she implied she needed a doctor, so it doesn't take much to pick up on the hints that she's running out of days. This comes to a head as Abigail confesses to Kazran that she's dying, even if we as the viewer don't get to see this conversation at this point. You can feel the mood turn, and I adore the framing as she goes back into her stasis. As soon as she's frozen again, you see Kazran through the porthole, his face hardening as he grows cold. It represents the loss of his childish joy and optimism, a visual indicator of how losing Abigail is the new catalyst for him becoming the cold and evil Kazran Sardic we met at the beginning. It's further cemented by things like taking the bow tie off and literally closing the curtains on this chapter of his life, forcing the Doctor away and cutting him off completely. It's a strong turning point for the narrative, everything crashing down. Just as it seemed like the Doctor's plan was working, it suddenly shatters, with the painting of Kazran's dad reappearing, returning to this course of his life under his father's influence. He ends up callous and selfish after all, which bursts the cutesy bubble and shows the crushing inevitability of time. Like we've found out so many times before, you can't battle the laws of time. The timelines will almost always fix themselves in one way or another. Even the Doctor couldn't pull this plan off, which shows how hard time fights back. Rather than becoming cold and heartless as a child, it simply postponed a few years, Kazran now blaming the Doctor rather than his father. You see in the change of life lessons he learns. In the beginning, he learned this from his father.
I learned life's most invaluable lesson. Nobody comes.
And then after all his stuff with the Doctor, he learns this.
There's a very old friend of mine once took a very long time to explain. Life isn't fair.
Part 4. The Ghost of Christmas Present.
Didn't think this was over, did ya? I'm the ghost of Christmas present.
Funnily enough, the present day aspect in the middle of any Christmas Carol adaptation is one of the hardest. You need to keep your Scrooge bitter and cynical going into it, but you also need to have him warming enough for things he previously ignored or hated to now have an emotional effect on him. Doctor Who again switches things up by using Amy as the Ghost of Christmas Present, representing all the people on the ship who will die. Kazran has given up on the Doctor and needs something different to influence him. Rather than showing old Tiny Tim hobbling along coughing his lungs out, it makes a lot more narrative sense to have Amy showing him all the people he needs to save. The whole singing for their lives thing is a bit cheesy and Moffat-y, but it serves its purpose. Tucked away in his cold and empty mansion, Kazran can easily ignore the thousands of people on the ship, but by bringing them up as a hologram, Amy is showing them as individual people. She brings them to life in a way. He gets to see the fear and panic firsthand. It's a good way to incorporate the crashing spaceship storyline and make it incredibly relevant to the story. It also fleshes out Kazran further by showing how his love for Abigail is what made him cold, because he blames the Doctor for cursing him with the choice of which day should be her last. The important part of this is that you can understand his reasoning. The Doctor introduced him to this wonderful new aspect of his lonely life, but in doing so he also gave him this impossible responsibility. It's easy to see how this would weigh heavily on someone and harden them to the point of being evil, but we also know the Doctor wouldn't consciously put someone through such torment, because they themselves have to carry the weight of so many deaths. Like he says,
Better a broken heart than no heart at all.
Kazran may not think the Doctor has been through this kind of heartbreak, but as a viewer, we know he couldn't be any further from the truth, because this is the Doctor's life. Part 5. The Ghost of Christmas Future.
You've seen the past, present, and now you need to see the future.
Lastly, in any Christmas Carol story, you have to have the future. Now, fortunately, Moffat decided against a nightmare-inducing Grim Reaper in a graveyard, which, to be honest, is rather surprising considering the Grand Moff loves to scare children. Instead, he manages to complete the trifecta of ingenious, brand new ways to present the ghosts. Rather than the Doctor returning to be the ghost of future, he turns the table by revealing that old Kazran himself is the ghost, serving as a stark warning to the child Kazran. It's a fantastic reveal, showing just how much like his daddy became. It's unexpected but makes perfect sense when you consider who Kazran is, and the 2 attempts that have already failed. We know the biggest thing he fears is his father. That's one of the first things the Doctor noticed. So when the older Kazran sees his past self genuinely believing he's his father, it puts everything into perspective and shows just how far he's fallen by becoming the one thing he fears most in the world. It's a shock to the system and the perfect way to pay off the journey, remaining a good subversion of the usual structure. By seeing himself so young and innocent, the older Kazran is also reminded of all those happy memories the Doctor gave him, finally realising this mysterious visitor wasn't trying to punish him after all. And because the episode already has slowly seen the older Kazran warming and softening, the shift in attitude doesn't feel like it happens overnight, if you'll pardon the expression. The legwork has already been done. This is just the trigger, although I think we'll overlook the massive bootstrap paradox created by the 2 different Kazrans. At least it's not as bad as the Big Bang's mess. Part 6. Boxing Day Cheese. Throughout the episode, the Sardic Cloud Machine was set up to be the big, literal plot device, the only way to save Amy and Rory from their death in the clouds. Rather cleverly though, Moffat establishes that the changes in the timeline have locked Kazran out of the Cloud Machine, which is a good way to maintain the stakes and not save the day of a flick of a switch. However, the actual solution to the crisis feels just as much of a cop-out, since Abigail just sings to the clouds and that fixes everything. I will admit there's a lot of emotional weight as Kazran is now forced to confront the inevitability of Abigail's death. Even though they can share Christmas Day together on a fun sleigh ride like their first ever Christmas Eve, everything has to come to an end, which makes the final scene incredibly bittersweet. It's a powerful character payoff, but I don't like how magical and fairy tale the ending itself is. The day is saved through the power of song, which is the closest the show has ever come to having a godforsaken musical episode. Side note, fans need to stop demanding one. I don't care how good it would be, I just can't stand musicals. The song itself is powerful, Jenkins' voice and Murray Gold's score combining perfectly for an emotional and bittersweet climax, but it's just the fact that this is what saves everything. I know the episode gives it a scientific explanation, but really? The power of song? And sure, real sharks can live for 30 years, so I have no problems believing an alien air shark can live for over 50, but the ending as a whole just lays it on way too thick with a fairy tale musical climax, so it's cheesy and groan-worthy. But actually, you know what? I think just this once, this old Smith-era Scrooge will give it a free pass. That's my Christmas present to you all. A Christmas Carol is exactly that, a Christmas Carol. This episode is everything you'd expect from a Doctor Who adaptation of the Christmas classic. It stands out with a brand new take, switching things up on every level, finding great new ways to present the ghosts and visions inspiring Scrooge to change his ways. Michael Gambon is fantastic as Kazran, lending such a believable personality to the character. He goes from a comically irredeemable villain to a sweet old man, and it all feels so real. Matt Smith also does an incredible job, one of his best episodes in the show, capturing a lot of intensity whilst also carrying the natural charisma and whimsy to become Kazran's magical friend, just like he did with Amelia. Speaking of, Amy and Rory are handled well, eased into the background of the narrative without being forgotten. The episode itself is very Christmassy, which is an improvement from the original Davis era specials, which just kind of had a Christmas backdrop. I would place A Christmas Carol at an A rank on the Series 5 tier list and also on the specials tier list. There are a few things holding it back, like the directing being a bit distractingly try-hard at points, and there is some very weird writing and dodgy narrative decisions. All the stuff with Abigail and her cryo-freezing is one step away from a horror movie, rather than the doomed lovers concept the episode was aiming for. Overall though, A Christmas Carol is a fun, emotional and somewhat timeless Doctor Who story. As much as it pains me to admit, it definitely deserves its mantle as one of the best Christmas specials, although nothing could ever take the crown from Last Christmas. So with that, that's all the Series 5 episodes done and dusted. Which means I guess you could say we're
halfway out of the dark.
And I'd like to give an extra special thank you to my Diamond level patron Fallon Cortez, and all my Gold level patrons, Alex Marston, Basil Disco PhD, Calvin, Daniel Shillito, Francois aka Line Vortex, George, Sion Wagner, and Stefan Never Miller. Thank you so much for your support.